Hello, welcome everybody to this 45-minute session on the BRICS Plus and G20, the path to collective action. I'm adding a question mark behind that. I welcome our speakers. We will be quizzing them, their stellar panel. And first, I want to explain why you have red and green cards. It's because you will be participating in the session. We will be showing some statements on the screens that you have on both sides. And you get to show us if you agree with the green card or if you disagree with the red card. And also the panel will be voting, of course, on those things. So before we start everything, let's look at some maps that will show us how the G20 and how BRICS Plus look in 2024, because there has been some interesting expansion. So first we see the G20 now with the African Union membership, which is quite substantive. And we see BRICS Plus also showing us some of the countries that are interested in joining. I understand that it's up to 40 countries that have expressed interest. So let's go with the first statement and see what you think about that, if you agree or disagree with it. Minilateral forums like the G20, BRICS Plus, and G7 are no substitute for the universal membership United Nations. What do you think about that, green or red? Don't be shy. Most of you agree, also my entire panel. Good. So let's start with this statement, and I want to ask Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, who is from the South African Institute for International Affairs. What do you think is so minilateral about the G20 now that the African Union has joined, given that you were a strong advocate for that membership?
Well, it's important that the African Union has joined because of all the countries represented in the G20. Of course, Africa was the one that had the least number of members in the G20. So bringing in the African Union is one way of amplifying some of the issues that are important for Africa that is no longer just the responsibility of South Africa. It's still a minilateral forum because it's not the United Nations. It's a club. It's not that all 55 member states of Africa are going to be sitting around the table when the G20 meets, in the same way that when the European Union is at the table, although the European Union, of course, is a supranational body as opposed to the AU, it's not all 27 member states that sit around the table. So it is still a smaller grouping. It's an informal grouping. It's not the UN, and it creates now the opportunity, from an African perspective, for us to help put on the agenda and shape the agenda and its outcomes, issues and ways of solving global problems that also reflect very strongly African concerns.
Any topics in particular that you think Africa will be pushing for?
Absolutely. I mean, we've been talking about it most of today, global financial architecture. We've spoken about the common framework, the G20 common framework on debt treatment. That has been moving very slowly. Yes, there has been some movement, but it doesn't really deal fundamentally with some of the big issues of how you deal with private creditors, how you make sure that all of the public creditors are on board in a timeous fashion. It's about scaling up the World Bank, multilateral development banks. It's also about exploring things like, for example, special drawing rights and how we use them, how we leverage them in a much more effective way. And there is a proposal on the table from the African Development Bank and the Inter-American Bank. I know that Germany has not been, and the European Union has not been entirely comfortable with that proposal, but that's one way of using the SDRs and retaining their reserve asset in a way that helps to bring some of the billions of the trillions that we need for the SDGs and for climate to the countries that really need the capital injection to be able to undertake the developmental priorities that they have.
All right, thank you. I want to ask now Marta Fernandes from the BRICS Policy Center in Brazil. We just looked at the map, and as I had just mentioned, many countries have expressed interest in joining BRICS. What is it that makes it so, this club so popular, so to say?
I think that the BRICS turned out to be very attractive, not only for material reasons, because of course these countries are looking for investment for material resources, and you have China there that in fact attracts these countries, but also in the terrain of the ideas of a non-material terrain, because BRICS represent in some way a unity in the diversity and unity. So I think that what was attractive is this idea of a South, but not a homogeneous South. A South that does not impose a unique view of how states have to behave, which currency they have to have. So I think that in some way, some people say that the difference between these states are a signal of weakness. I think the contrary, that is exactly these differences, the idea that they are demanding a more democratic way of organizing global governance, to have their own currency, to have their own languages, to have their own values and political systems that in some way connect these countries against this idea of a leader that in some way impose these rules and these norms to the world.
Is that how the G20 works?
Not necessarily. I think that the G20 in some way represent these tensions between the North and the South, but both in some way with the G7 and the BRICS arrive there more articulated. But some topics of the international arena can be more productive discussed in the G20 than in the BRICS. You know that now with these geopolitical tensions, some topics cannot be discussed in BRICS. So in some way, there in the G20, some countries, is the case of Brazil, what Brazil is trying to do now is to construct a bridge between the South and the North, and so try to articulate some common positions, some consensus in these topics, because Brazil understands that it's impossible to separate geopolitical from economic, for example, issues.
Yes.
The war of Ukraine, for example, have consequence to energetic, food security, for all these things. But in some way, Brazil thinks that in the G20, he has more freedom to articulate some topics that cannot be so easily discussed in the BRICS, but the two are complementary.
I want to fetch that, actually, to ask Patrick Stewart from the Carnegie Endowment. What are the advantages and disadvantages of these minilateral fora compared to the UN, for example? Because she just said Brazil feels more comfortable within the G20 with some topics, but then the BRICS has also some advantages.
Yeah, I mean, there needs to be a trade-off, right? And ideally, these things would be complementary. Most countries around the world are looking to increase, particularly important countries, are looking to increase their room for maneuver. The United States was a major pioneer of some of these sort of GX groupings. You know, the world is not G20, not G7, BRICS, et cetera. It's increasingly GX. So you're seeing flexible coalitions of the willing that come together, often around specific purposes and sometimes for multiple purposes. And that's all well and good. I think that flexible coalitions allow you to move with dispatch. You don't have to go through some lumbering international organization. They allow you to put together groups that, on some issues at least, are relatively like-minded and capable. but they do come at some cost. And I think that that's particularly true for the countries of the Global South. I know that BRICS and BRICS Plus like to frame themselves as the champions of the Global South. It's a little hard for me to imagine when I see, the new entrants will be the UAE and Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure that they're totally Global South countries, but at any rate, there's all questions about, Russia and China as spokespeople of the Global South as well. But I do think that one of the things that is missing from BRICS and also from the G20, and gets to the question that people answered, that there are no substitute for the United Nations, is that in neither of these bodies, with the partial exception of the African Union as a bloc, are the world's poorest countries actually represented. So you have a bunch of countries largely, and I believe that BRICS, just like G20, G7 countries within the G20, are there primarily to advance their own national interests. We would love them to advance global solutions, of course, but that's not necessarily what's happening. So my point is that multilateralism a la carte makes sense, but you also have to have multilateralism a la charte, right? At the Charter of the United Nations. And so because you need the standing capabilities of United Nations agencies and other universal bodies, you need the legitimacy that comes with the UN Charter. And as asymmetrical as, in terms of power, as those universal organizations can be, they tend to at least be somewhat transparent, much more than G20 summits say, and they actually have the capacity to actually implement things. And my fear is, and we can get to this, is what we don't want to see is having a really rigid BRICS, a really rigid G7 plus within the G20, which takes away from one of the great advantages, or at least notional advantages of the G20. It's there to support flexible coalitions across these boundaries and build bridges.
Thank you, Patrick. I want to ask now Xiao Sheng from the Tsinghua University in China. Because we were talking about each group, but also about advantages, disadvantages. What do you think the expansion of these groups is actually signaling in terms of the multilateral institutions that clearly need some reforming, but are not advancing in that? So are we going to see more expansion of these groups and a weakening of the UN system, for example? Or where do you see this going?
First, thank you for having me here. From the Chinese perspective, I think this expansion of the BRICS actually it is what has been expected by many countries, because we have received applications from more than 40 countries from the Global South to join in the BRICS. And then after consultation, discussion, we have selected 6 countries, the BRICS, to join this BRICS. And I think there is also a very heated debate inside China about what the future of the BRICS, whether we are going to include more countries, and which may challenge the effectiveness of this institution. So there needs to be a balance between the effectiveness and the representativeness of this organization. But I should say that I also agree it is not a substitute to the United Nations. It is trying to representing the voice of the Global South. However, the United Nations is trying to show the voice around the world. It's more representative on that. So that is also my personal view.
So would it be a good idea to invite the UN Secretary General to the meetings of G20 and BRICS Plus? That question goes to the entire table.
He does attend, and in fact, a lot of the I don't know if he attends all the time, but he certainly was there last year, and certainly a lot of the UN agencies and the international financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank. So it's more than a G20 meeting, but it is, and I think one of the points that the Secretary General has made in the last couple of years is how can we use the G20 in a way that can actually mobilize and mobilize around the issues that are the priority at the moment, which is the Agenda 2030. It's the summit for the future. Use the G20 as an important platform to build consensus among some of the more important countries in the world. You're absolutely right. The low-income countries, the SIDSs are not there. But how can you, use the collective power that the G20 represents potentially, to actually move forward some of these UN debates. I mean, I think one of the reasons we mustn't forget has encouraged this growth in these informal groupings is the paralysis
Exactly, yeah.
in the formal multilateral system. Just, you know, so we've had some movement in the WTO, the most recent ministerial, but you know, we heard yesterday the disputes. We know the dispute settlement process is stalled.
I wonder who. Yeah, I can't imagine who could partially be responsible for that.
You know, we see what's happening in the UN. There's been some movement in the World Bank, but one of the reasons, for example, that the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and the New Development Bank were established was to create alternative options for leveraging or for raising development finance, because it wasn't happening quickly enough, and the reforms also around quotas and so on were not happening quickly enough. So the question is, in this geopolitically fraught environment, how do we rebuild trust in the multilateral system, and can we use these minilateral bodies and coalitions of the willing to try to bridge these gaps? Because I absolutely agree, you know, this
That
is not
ties
about...
perfectly to the next statement that we're going to show on screen now, and that we're going to have you vote, please. So let's see it. BRICS Plus and the G20 are complementary organizations, regardless of their differences in values. Okay, now we have a bit of a mix going on here. This is going to be more difficult.
This is to make your life difficult.
Yes, I'm going to go with the table, 50-50, I'd say. So let's discuss this. What are your thoughts on this?
It's
Complementary
really
or not?
Yeah, I think it's really hard a decision because the first part of this, the sentence is a complementary organizations. I think yes, but the second part, they differ in values. I really doubt it because I firmly believe that both G20 and the BRICS Plus have values, common values like multilateralism. They try to build global economic cooperation, and also they try to achieve also cooperation and for different countries, which is the core value of the multilateralism. So I think they have something in common. However, they are different because they are different in their focus. One is trying to bridge the difference between the developing countries and developed countries. However, the BRICS, they are focusing on trying to focus on the concerns of the developing and the global south countries. That's why we have new developments, as you mentioned. We are more focused on this and also capacity building of the developing countries, and also trying to...
So you mean South-South cooperation, for example, or...?
South-South cooperation within the BRICS.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think this both yes and no.
How about you, Marta? What do you think about that statement?
I said complementary because I think that what we are seeing now is a kind of decentralized global governance operating in interconnected scales. So in some way, BRICS and G7, for example, can meet in G20, and then in some way it's easier to forge a consensus in these forums, because they are more flexible, more informal, and sometimes more open to social movements and of these. And so, but this does not replace the United Nations, that is the universal and multilateral per excellence, and where each state has a voice, has a vote. So it's important also.
And yet we've seen that within the United Nations it's stuck, right? The reforms are stuck, it's not going forward, and especially many global south countries feel they're not advancing there. So can these two groups then maybe come together and tackle some of the bigger problems that we're seeing, the global challenges that we're seeing? Can they do it? And if yes, which ones, for example?
I've got a couple that I'll mention. One of them, I think, is on digital public infrastructure and conceivably having the advantages of artificial intelligence help the developing world, help particularly the poorest countries. You know, it's interesting, India in particular, a member of both BRICS and the G20, is a huge leader in digital public infrastructure and trying to get to its citizens the benefits of the digital revolution in a way that doesn't make them sort of subordinate at the hands of big technology platforms. And I think that this is a really interesting area where you could imagine some cooperation amongst the BRICS and G20, because people want the benefits of this revolution.
Any other issues? Sorry, Elizabeth, from African viewpoint, for example?
You can finish. And
well, yeah, I'll just say, and by the way, and both the high-level advisory body at the UN and the Global Digital Compact also call for an AI for Development fund, and I think it's a very interesting idea. The other issue that I was going to comment on that I think could be very useful would be biodiversity cooperation.
We're talking right now between BRICS Plus and G20, not with the UN.
No, BRICS Plus and G20, and Brazil, obviously, a member of both, hugely biodiverse and has made this a big part of its G20 presidency. China, with the Kunming Montreal Biodiversity Framework, really involved in this. Most of the G20 countries, including a number of BRICS countries, highly biodiverse countries. This is an area where I think that there actually could be some cooperation, and it's not as controversial as some of the other issues. It's much less political. It's about saving our planet as opposed to some of the other things.
And yet we're not doing much to save it. So, Elizabeth?
I mean, the other dimension, and I would agree on digital public infrastructure, on biodiversity. I mean, the other area is potentially health. Particularly around vaccines, around... I mean, the one area which is problematic is intellectual property rights.
Yes.
But if we were to put that to the side, I think there are a number of avenues of potential collaboration across divides on areas of health. I mean, so biodiversity, to some issues around climate, I think, although it is increasingly geopolitical. Unfortunately, but certainly health, food security, agriculture, those kinds of areas which can also tie in with linked to sort of climate smart agriculture and that kind of thing.
Marta, do you see already any conversations happening on these things, like between BRICS and G20?
Yeah, I see. I saw another kind of conversation about the reform of the international order, the international institutions. For example, in the last summit in South Africa, in the declaration, there is this intention to reform and democratize the Security Council of the United Nations. So the United Nations is great, all the states are there, but as the Bretton Woods institutions is old because reflect these correlations of forces after the Second World War. So I think that this agenda, Brazil is trying to, in some way, migrate to the G20. So to talk about, of course, the reform of the international financial institutions, but also in the first meeting of the foreign minister in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, Brazil brings the idea of the reform of the Security Council, because it's very, for Brazil, it's very strange that the countries that are more the defenders of democracy inside the states does not did the same claim related to the democratization of the global governance, of the international organization. So the claim of Brazil is to transversalize democracy inside the states, but also in the international arena.
Could I have a two-finger on that?
Sure.
Yeah, just I agree that the UN Security Council needs to be reformed, but one of the big problems, but this is true within the G20, but it's also true within BRICS, is that the participants, even if everybody agrees on UN Security Council reform, they have no agreement on the precise formula by which that should occur, so that our friends in Argentina might not like the fact that Brazil has an aspiration for a permanent seat with a veto in the Security Council, and so on and so on. So I think that, in part, these, and in Africa, AU can agree on which of the candidates that it wants to be the permanent Security Council seat. So there's a lot of divisions already that exist, and part of the reason for why we have BRICS and part of the reasons we have G20 is precisely because of frustration with how ossified and some of these institutions are. And I also agree with you that BRICS is an important and not just symbolic desire to try to get away from a system that seems hierarchically still controlled by the West. And so it's an important vehicle. I think its importance is sometimes more symbolic than substantive, but that's another discussion.
And there are other two areas, I think, which can have cooperation between the G20 and the BRICS. One is the poverty reduction, because I know that is also one of the priority of the Brazil in this G20 presidency. And another is the capacity building, either in sustainable development or in the AI, as we have mentioned, how to face the, reduce the challenges or the risks that were posed by AI in the future. So these are the two areas, I think, which is also very important for cooperation.
So if you had to pick some areas, you would say, okay, these are the two that we could start immediately working together between these two groups, or where do you see
I think
that they are
poverty
right now?
reduction is very ready to be there, because Brazil is also very interested in that, and China here, we have a lot of experiences and lessons to be shared. So, and also there's a large majority of people who are below the poverty level, so it is really important to pay attention to. And also for AI, G20 is also a very good platform for having some cooperation on AI. I haven't seen much progress in BRICS at the moment, because many countries, they are not very developed in AI capabilities. So the capacity building is also very important for those global South countries. Yeah.
And we've heard a few sessions about AI governance also during this conference. So do you agree with that? Do you think it would be possible to do something on that pretty fast?
Well, I think the point about poverty is well made, and the way in which one argues that is that the issue of poverty, inequality, the issue of social justice and solidarity, which we heard about yesterday, it is in everybody's interest, rich and poor countries, to actually do something about it. Because many of the divisions, both internally and across countries, are driven often by these underlying factors and these structural factors. So there should be a desire in both, and I think both try to tackle it, both groupings. And I would actually also add here in parenthesis, we should also think about the G7, to what extent does the G7 also contribute, or is complementary or not? Yes. But I think both the BRICS and the G20 have identified some of these issues. I mean, the G20 recognized in 2010, 2011, when it came up with the development consensus, the Seoul Development Consensus, that when we talk about global financial reforms, we can't think about it just at the banking level. We actually have to think about how it impacts society. And so the development working group was formed and so on. And there is a very real imperative among many BRICS countries that face similar problems to actually deal with issues of poverty and inequality. So that is a good fit, and it takes us back to what also Dennis Snow has been saying about the importance of recoupling, of bringing the social in very powerfully. And it's also one of the issues that is likely to feature in the South African G20 presidency next year. But just one last thing. I think it is so important to make all efforts to preserve the G20 as a space where both developing, global South, and global North, advanced economies can actually talk. If we allow it to be paralyzed, as we've come very close to in the last couple of years, I think that deepens the the divisions and the fractures.
Can I pick up on that? I mean,
Sure.
the great beauty of the G20. I remember writing this back in the early days in the 2009, 2010, is that it, at least in principle, it provides a platform. It's the only platform where the heads of government or heads of state of the world's most important established and emerging economies meet exclusively, and where you can actually have the possibility of sort of flexible coalitions of consensus that bridge across these divides. And it also provides an opportunity, at least in principle, for middle powers like Brazil to basically make these kind of sometimes strange bedfellows and brings folks together. And I think that that what we can't have happen is, as you say, Elizabeth, to have it somehow reinforce the divisions that we see in our world between East and West, between North and South, and I think that there are possibilities of some cooperation to prevent that. In the case of AI, just really quickly, AI needs, there are several functional needs. One of them is, basically scientific consensus and knowledge about the state of AI. Some IPCC type thing for AI. That would be one possibility. Another one is more work on regulatory and harmonization and standard settings. Now, different political systems, that will be a challenge at times.
Yeah.
The third one is AI access and benefit sharing for these models, for these algorithms, for compute, all of these things. And then finally, the sort of more security threats that come with AI, because of course they can be, aspects of it, if not can be weaponized, at least used for weapons. So.
Do you want to add something? Or?
Yeah, I think I would to add that it's important to say that this troika are formed by 3 countries of BRICS, that is, in fact, India, Brazil, and South Africa. So I think they, in some way, are able to advance their agenda. And Lula put he as the priority this year exactly the global alliance against hunger, against poverty. That because in some way one of the main considerations of Lula and concerns about the African debt, and what Brazil thinks is exactly this. The fact that in G20 you have developing and developed countries is very productive, because you can, in some way, try to find some common solutions to the debt of African countries that increase with the pandemics, with all these wars, and exactly what Brazil is trying to do with this kind of. There is a discussion about this change the debt for health, for fighting against hunger and education, etc.
Yes.
I also want to add that is, we should also bear in mind that both G20 and the BRICS are international economic cooperation organizations at its birth. We have a lot of different things adding on to their purpose. However, we should never let the differences in political systems or they have political disputes to hinder our cooperation in economic areas. That is very important for the future cooperation.
Yeah, I think in that regard, the G20 only works if countries are able to compartmentalize. They will have frictions. U.S. and China have frictions, but if they allow that to make it impossible for them to cooperate on other areas where they have such manifest shared interests, I think that's really disastrous.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the point here is that, in the 1990s, there was the much maligned end of history thesis, et cetera. But, we are living in a world that is diverse. We share some common values. We all share common challenges. But we don't necessarily all have the same values. And I think the point that we're going to have to figure out, and I know this is about global solutions, I don't necessarily have the answer to that, but the point we're going to have to figure out is how we work together when we may disagree on certain things. And I think the point about compartmentalizing is fine, but the fact that we disagree on certain things or that we have different positions on different conflicts in the world, is not a reason
Exactly.
on its own for us not to try to work on global challenges. I'm gonna say what our former president had said when he was still in prison. You know, you don't speak to your friend, you negotiate with your enemies. I'm not suggesting we are enemies, but you know, there is competition, there is rivalry, and you don't necessarily always agree. And you've got to come to some modus vivendi to take things forward.
But at least on this panel, you seem to agree that both groups could potentially work together, that a good topic would be poverty reduction. We have now 7 minutes left. Let's talk about concrete actions. How would it look like if these two groups come together and work on poverty reduction? For example, I mean, the SDGs are going to run out soon. Would these two groups be the ones putting up, you know, whatever will come next after the 2030 agenda, for example? Thoughts?
Well, certainly. I mean, one of the who came up with the SDGs? Wasn't it Brazil playing a central role? And of course, Kenya was a key negotiator in that process. I think that so agenda setting, I think, can be one of the ways. But I wouldn't put the BRICS and the G20 sort of. You know, the BRICS are part of the G20, or at least the original BRICS.
There is an overlap.
Yes, are part of the G20, and the G7 are part of the G20. I think the G20 as a collective, and whether that means working together initially in caucuses to build consensus, can certainly think about the next step. But more importantly, I would say, if we're talking about SDGs, and SDGs are very important, is how do we make sure that we're not sitting in 2030 with maybe 25% of the SDGs achieved. I mean, you know, the report last year was sobering in terms of how many of the and there are proposals on the table by the UN Secretary General in terms of his stimulus, the SDG stimulus, etc., etc.
But what would
and
be
so how can we work together in the G20 to actually really drive that forward?
But what would be the concrete action then of these two groups in poverty reduction, for example?
So the G20's purpose is, I would understand it to be structural, to transform structurally. It's not about undertaking small projects. Okay, so we shouldn't be thinking about projects. I think we should be thinking about some of the barriers to addressing poverty, rather than saying, oh, we'll work together on a joint project that will help Burundi move people, whether it is, for example, helping to set up effective social safety nets or protection schemes at a global level, whether it is removing some of the hindrances to how debt is negotiated and renegotiated, enabling more effective domestic resource mobilization so that countries actually have more money, hopefully to spend wisely in reducing poverty. So international taxation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, so I see the G20 operating at that level rather than looking at specific projects, which can be done by individual partners, donors, etc.
Mm-hmm. I hear agreement here, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think that to fight against poverty and hunger, you have to fight against the unequal distribution of economic power in the world. So this requires structural changes, and it's very important to be open to different experiences and successful experiences, as in the case of China, to reduce poverty. So in Brazil, we have several programs of cash transfer, for example, and so it's very important to have this interchange of experience, of course, considering the specific of each context and environment.
We have 3 more minutes, so I also want to hear from
Yeah, I just
this side
I
of the
think
table.
we have a lot to do in poverty reduction, and the experience sharing and the best practice sharing is very important. China has a lot of experience in poverty reduction, and it has done well in the past few years. But we also realize that people sometimes return back to poverty after they are lifted out of the poverty. So what is the reason? The first thing is, that's why I emphasize so much on capacity building. We have an old saying saying that if you give people fish, why not teach him how to catch fish? So that is why important that the developed countries should help the capacity building for the developing countries. And another thing is important from the Chinese perspective is the infrastructure. Why Chinese people are so keen to building roads? Because we think if you connect the cities to the outside world, then you can help them to make rich. So that is the 2 experience I think very important for the poverty reduction
Thank you.
program. Yeah.
Patrick.
Yeah,
one
I would
last
say,
minute.
yeah, I'll make it quick. I think that I think you make a really good point, and what's interesting is the different approaches that G7 countries have often taken to, and traditional DAC donors have taken to development cooperation versus some of the newer donors on the stage. And I think that there tends to be a lot of fighting about, well, our solution is better than yours is, yes, there may be criticisms about the nature of Chinese development assistance or some other countries' development assistance that isn't entirely aligned with OECD DAC. But we need the principles. But I think the important thing is to focus on is it making the overall situation better? And if there can be a division of labor between these things. If it turns out that China is simply better at delivering infrastructure, then conceivably the West focuses on other things. Just in terms of other concrete economic things, you mentioned debt relief, and China being a part of joining with the Paris Club to help debt relief would be really important. I could imagine cooperation on issues of illicit financial flows, taxation, and sort of universalizing the OECD principles and approach to that. There are a number of others, but there's no shortage of concrete examples where we could have some cooperation between these 2 groups.
That's wonderful. Then, because time is running, we can obviously keep on discussing afterwards, but I think there's some good brain power at this table to precisely help put with those concrete actions between those 2 groups to find solutions for everybody, hopefully. Thank you very much, then.
Thank you for
Thank
keeping
you.
the time.
Yeah.